Tell the truth about what you're angry about, but also tell the truth to yourself about what you want. And then start with little negotiations in that direction, and you'll get better and better at it. It's part of an alarm system. It's the same alarm system that tells you when something unexplored is dangerous. And if you're in a social situation, and the consequence of being in this situation is that you're being humiliated and undermined, then obviously you haven't mapped out that situation very well. This is a very good strategy. You try this with your wife or your husband. You could make this a rule. It's about the only psychological technique that I know that actually works, because most of what constitutes psychological technique is too sophisticated to boil down into something like a procedure, you know, without it becoming false. But this works. So imagine, here's the rule. I'm going to listen to you. We're discussing some problem we want to solve. I'm going to listen to you. And then I'm going to wait till you tell me that you're done talking, right? So you've said what you have to say. And I'm going to leave that up to you. And then I'm going to tell you what you just told me. Just every time you listen to someone from now on, it's like they go off on some communicative tangent. You say, this is what I think you said. Did I get it right? And maybe they say, well, no, not exactly. Here's what I really meant. You know, there might be some tussling about the precise meaning of the utterance, but I'll tell you, man, people will be thrilled with you if you can do that. And they will. Here's something else that's ridiculously cool about this. If you're bored by people, you are not listening to them. If you listen to them, they will get so interesting that you want to run away from them. Because if you listen to people, they will tell you everything. And that's really something, because once people start to reveal themselves, they get so interesting that it's almost unbearable. It's one of the things I loved about being a clinician, because I could listen to people and they would tell me who they were, and wow. Well, then you schedule that, and obviously there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig, you dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, So maybe you do an hour of responsibility, and then you play a video game for goals that you actually value. And the Future Authoring Program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. If you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. Reward is intensely useful in terms of modifying behavior, but the problem is that it's really hard to notice when things are going right, because you're kind of primed to notice when things are going wrong, and so you use threat and punishment more often as agents of shaping the people that you're around, because when everything's going right, it's like, then you notice she does something good, you think, there's no goddamn way I'm going to reward her for that, so you ignore her when she does something good. It's like, that's brilliant, that is, because then you've just punished her for doing what you want. And people do that with their kids all the time, because they let the kids dominate them, then they get resentful, then the kid will run up to them to show them something that's kind of spectacular, and they're not happy. They're like, oh yeah, that's, I'm working. Little kid is
all sad about that, and he's just learned something. So, and it's not perhaps what you want him to learn. And so you have to keep your relationship with your children pristine, and that means that you can't hold a grudge or resent them, and that means that you have to help them learn how to behave so that you like them. And that way, if you like them and you're kind of sensible, and maybe your partner also likes them, so you know you got a consensus going there. One thing I remember with my son, who is he's quite disagreeable by temperament, which is actually a good thing as far as I'm concerned, although it brings its own challenges. And so with my daughter, when she was misbehaving, she was pretty agreeable. And you know, if she was misbehaving, I could basically just look at her and then she'd quit, you know. But my son, it was like, that was just nothing. You're looking at me? It's like, no, that's just not going to go anywhere, man. And so then I'd like tell him to stop, and that really wasn't having much of an effect either. He'd just sort of maybe laugh or run away or whatever. I mean, he was a tough little rat. And you know, what I would do with him is he would be doing something and I'd interfere and he'd get upset and, you know, angry, and so then I'd get him to sit on the steps, and I told him, and this is when he was about 2, I said, look, you're going to sit on the steps, that's time out. You're going to sit on the steps until you've got control of yourself and you can come back and play the family game again. I basically said, be a civilized human being and then you're welcome again. As a philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside, outside. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical extension of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really have. So one of Nietzsche's claims, for example, was that as Christianity in Europe transformed itself into science, he felt that one of the advantages to the Catholic domination of Europe for so many centuries was that the mind of the Catholic adherents who took the discipline seriously, or the dogma seriously, learned to interpret all events under the schema of a single theory. And that's when Dostoevsky basically prophesied, so to speak, that one of the consequences of the death of God would be the rise, basically, of communist totalitarianism, because essentially that's what he predicted in The Devils. So that's pretty dead-on accurate prediction. It was really quite stunning to me when I came across it. And Nietzsche made exactly the same prediction, by the way. And so for those two men, the death of an ultimate meaning system, especially one that, you see, when you think about something like European Christianity, it's misleading in some sense, because the system of beliefs that constituted European Christianity and other great belief systems wasn't 2,000 years old. It was like 25,000 years old. You know, you can think about it as beginning at year 0, but it's a mistake from a historical perspective. And some of those people, as far as we can tell, had lived a lifestyle that was essentially unchanged for 25,000 years. And so the Australian Aborigines are like that. So there's plenty of evidence that these ideas are extraordinarily old, and what that means is that when we separate from them, in some sense, not only do we separate from our philosophical presuppositions, but we separate from the historical consequences of our biology. It's a serious problem, and I think that's partly why it's very difficult to distinguish between someone who's nihilistic and someone who's mentally ill. That's not a radical claim. I mean, people, especially who are on the depressed side of the distribution, will tell you that they're nihilistic. Nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests? Point of departure. It is an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration or corruption of all things as the cause of nihilism. Now, that's a typical Nietzschean phrase, because there are 3 profound ideas in that sentence, and each one is in a different phrase. So Nietzsche said at one point, I can write in a sentence what other people write in a book. And then he said, well, what other people can't even write in a book. And this sentence is a good example of that. So what does he say? Well, you know, if you see that people are suffering and in trouble, one thing you can say is that the reason for that is that the economic system is unjust and they're layered along the bottom, and that's the fundamental cause of their suffering. But Nietzsche doesn't allow that to be an interpretation, a causal interpretation, because he says there are multiple ways of interpreting your position, and mere absence of material luxury does not necessarily destine you to one perspective. What are you mad about? Write it down.
And like, be kind of comprehensive about it. Or maybe talk to a friend. I would say write it down, but you can talk to a friend. Write down everything that makes you angry. And you're going to think, well, some of those things that make me angry are stupid. It's like, yeah, probably. That's not the question here. We're not trying to figure out if you're reasonable or not. Of course you're not, because who is? So you're not. So write down everything that makes you angry. Okay, so what'll happen then? You have a comprehensive list of what makes you angry. Now, they may have, done what they could to remain blind to the problem. But often, they just don't, the other person just has never told them, here's what's wrong and here's what I want. They expect them to know or something, and people just don't. They're just not that bright, It's like, you'd know if you loved me. You'd know what I needed if you loved me. I bet, how many of you have said that? It's like, you should have your lips sewn together if you say that. Because the right response to that is, no, I'm stupid. You have no idea. I'm so stupid I married you. And so, how much do you think you can expect from me? I can barely do what you tell me to do. So write down everything that makes you angry. Okay, so what'll happen then? You have a comprehensive list of what makes you angry, and the first thing that you'll figure out is that some of those things just shouldn't make you angry. It's like time to grow the hell up, and get over that. But then there's other things on there, and maybe you can talk to someone about that. You think, well, this makes me angry. For 10 minutes, or would you do it for 10 minutes like 3 times a week? You have to negotiate. What's the other person willing to do? You need to know what you want and need, and then you need to communicate it to them, and then you need to negotiate a solution. And that's how you get more assertive. And you start small. You get more assertive by telling the truth, right? That's how. It's like, I'm irritated and annoyed that this isn't happening, and here's something that you could conceivably offer me, and this is what I'm willing to do in return. And
Now, let's go back to this guy who's having the murderous fantasies. Now, he's humiliated in high school. So you ask yourself, why? Well, there's a pretty good literature on bullying, and generally, bullies poke at all sorts of people, and they start with little pokes, and if they can get a response that's gratifying to their desire to shame, then they'll keep attacking. But they start off small, and not everybody gets bullied. Most people get bullied some when they're kids, but some people are targeted fairly frequently, and they're people who tend to react in the manner the bully wants. If you're allowed to bump up against the rough edges of the world, the natural world and the social world, and if you have someone that you can communicate with, the probability is pretty high that you can learn incrementally how to map the world and your actions in it, so that the probability that you're going to be pathologically prone to catastrophe and betrayal is much reduced. So I'll tell you a story about my mother. So one day I was out playing baseball in an abandoned lot, an empty lot near my house, and my wife was there. We were only about 8 or 9, 10, something like that. I was there with some of my friends. One of them was a tough little guy. I was little too, but not as tough. These stories that the psychologist's students wrote about their past traumas were curative, because if they used words that indicated understanding, comprehension, then they were remapping the territory that they hadn't mapped properly the first time they walked.
How do we continue to encourage children to question and develop their own moral compass in a world that is so determined to tell us what to think?
I think probably in your own home, you just encourage that kind of behavior. I think one of the things we did reasonably well with our kids was encourage them to think. We listened to them, right? And negotiated with them. And so if you model that in your home, first of all, that'll alert them to the difference between a functional home and a pathological learning environment. That's a good thing for them to learn. And second, you can help them become sophisticated in their capacity to articulate themselves. Man, if you could get them telling their story, they're so damn interesting that is unbearable. And so, and you'll know people so well if you listen to them, because they will tell you who they are, and they'll be so happy with you that you're there to allow them to think things through, to facilitate that process. They'll flock to you, and you'll learn so much. It's so useful, and this is such a good technique. This works so well, and you can learn it pretty quickly, and you can implement it, you know, in your own relationship. That's the rules. Like, you get to talk, I'll tell you what you said until you agree with my summary. Then it's my turn. You do the same.
I've reviewed that literature like 6 times in the last 15 years because I keep hoping that someone will crack the problem, but it's always the same answer. It's like, you do brain training games, you get better at the game, a lot better at that game. You get slightly better at similar games, but distal games that are still heavily cognitively loaded doesn't affect your performance at all. Zero. None. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale, but the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work, you know, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to be. But and he'd get upset and, you know, angry, and so then I'd get him to sit on the steps, and I told him, and this is when he was about 2, I said, look, you're going to sit on the steps. That's timeout. You're going to sit on the steps until you've got control of yourself, and you can come back and play the family game again. I basically said, be a civilized human being, and then you're welcome again. And so he'd sit on the steps. It was so interesting to watch because he was just enraged. He'd sit there. Like, have you ever seen a 2-year-old have a temper tantrum? It's really quite the bloody phenomena. If you ever saw an adult do that, you'd call 911 right away. It's like, oh my God. And I've seen adults do that, you know, because people say with borderline personality disorder will have temper tantrums, and it's like, man, you want to be about 30 feet away from that person, that's for sure. It's really, but in kids, it's like, well, first of all, they're only this long, so how much trouble can they really cause? But it's like, you know, they're just completely gone. They're like on the floor, their face is red, they're just furious, like way more furious than you ever get if you're even vaguely socialized. They're just outraged, and they're kicking and hitting the ground, and like, it's like a little epileptic fit of anger, you know. They're completely controlled by their rage. And we took care of one kid for a while he was actually a pushover, that kid. You could get him to behave by, you know, kind of shaking your finger at him, but his mother thought he was really tough because he had her figured out. And one of the things he would